listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm a little bit more upbeat than usual. I mean, I'm going on vacation next week, so I'm excited about that. I think one thing that is exciting going on in the world of the Identity at the Center podcast is that we're getting a new logo. And I think where we are in things right now is that we've got it narrowed down. And I'm going to go on vacation and let you make the final decision. So if people like the logo, I was a part of choosing it. If people don't like the logo, Jeff made the final decision.
Yeah, thanks for throwing me under the bus there. Yeah, we'll see how this turns out. You know, I think coming underneath the Protivity banner, there are certain visual guidelines that we want to adhere to, right, from a branding perspective. So that's part of the deal. But it's a logo, and it's something that you'll probably see at some point. I don't know if it'll make it for this show or not, but at some point in the future, if it hasn't already hit, we'll have a shiny new logo that we can, I don't know, either talk about more or just forget that it ever happened. One of the two.
Hey, it's just a logo, right? For an audio-only podcast, is not really kind of central to what we do, but we want to have a good logo. Hey, all the options that I've seen so far, I think, are they're pretty good, right? And I don't want to call it an improvement. I like our logo now, but I also like these new options. So, anyway, so people will. Maybe by the time this podcast goes live, we'll already be on the new logo. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll see. I do think I do like them better. I think they are more professional looking and in full transparency. The one that's used out there now with the orange and kind of the white is something that I created in PowerPoint, of all things. And we've been using it for almost 2 years now. It references, for those that aren't familiar, the company that Jim and I used to work for, Identropy. So that orange kind of box with the ID was part of the logo for Identropy. And folks like Victor and Ash of former Identropy fame were kind enough to let me take my identity idea there and kind of spin it off into the Identity Center logo. So for those who are wondering, you could probably look back on old episodes if it hasn't already changed over. But the orange and white will be retiring, and we'll move more to probably more modern, something around shades of blue and white and things like that, a little bit cooler. So that'll be pretty neat. For those who can't see us, because that's everyone who's listening right now, we are doing an audio-only podcast, but we do use video behind the scenes just for visual cues and things like that. I can tell Jim is in vacation mode because he has just put on some sort of sun hat of some side. Jim, do you want to describe what it is you're actually wearing?
Yeah, it's a straw lifeguard hat. Got it on Amazon. And listen to me, my voice is cracking. It must be that I have a 13-year-old son whose voice is cracking, and I'm a good parent, right? I try to ignore when it happens, not giggle, right? Because heck, we've all gone through it. That's part of growing up. But I'm
still going through it.
You still go through it? Yeah, every once in a while. Those are the edits that happen behind the scenes. But yeah, I've got this straw lifeguard hat. It definitely puts me in the mindset of being on the beach, so I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, so before you escape for vacation, why don't we talk a little bit about identity and kind of pull it back? I think, we've had a lot of great conversations over the last couple of years, and we've brought back one of our greatest hits from the past. His name is Frank Villavicencio. He's the Chief Product Officer with Greenshades Software. He's also a strategic advisor for Hyper, HYPR, and also a frustrated semi-professional soccer player. So welcome back to the show, Frank.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be back.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So, you were back on the show in August of 2020, way back in episode 59. So, ancient times, considering where things are at now. What's new? What's changed over the last several months since we last talked with you?
So many things, starting with I have a new job. Back then I was at ADP, and now I'm at Greenshades. And more recently, I signed up as a strategic advisor for Hyper. And I went from playing about 3 to 4 times a week to now 7. This week could have probably been 8 times a week. So I'm intensifying my soccer playing.
So is this a career change? I mean, what are we looking to do here? Are you looking to blend identity and soccer or football, as the world will call it?
Yeah, football. That's a very interesting point. I'll have to just consider and meditate on that a little bit. What is interesting, Jeff, is I like playing so much, and now that we're working remote, I have more time to play, so I can squeeze this into my schedule. So I have started to pick up on the topic of longevity and how do you keep a healthy lifespan so I can play more soccer. That's kind of where it goes. I guess we can figure out a way to tie that back into identity somehow.
I would imagine, lifespan, all the accounts you accumulate over time. So you're a chief product officer with Greenshades. What does that mean? What's that in layman's terms so I can understand it?
Yeah. Greenshades focuses on HR, payroll, and tax for employers. And I had a very very smart, really focused product team, and we deliver products that help HR departments process payroll and the most important things around their workforce. And our end users are accessing online, whether it's mobile or web, many of them through a mobile device today. So we manage all of that interaction. We obviously have to secure it. Part of what we do, no matter how far you want to run from identity, you always have to solve the identity problem.
Yeah, and then you're also doing some work, I think, with Hyper, which is a player in the passwordless space, and we're certainly going to talk about passwordless, I think, quite a bit. What can you tell us about the work that you're doing with Hyper as a strategic advisor? How'd you get roped into that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a relationship back in the day when I was at ADP. We were exploring different options, and they came up as a promising option. So we established a relationship back then. When I left ADP, they approached me and thought that I could play a role in helping them craft the solution, the messaging, and the product capabilities around the kind of problems that I have been historically solving. And so we thought that was very synergetic. And so far, it's been an exciting ride.
Hey, Frank, we all know that cows move, right?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was like the closing remark from our last episode. And, I thought about how I fumbled that question, Jim, over the, almost a year since. So you remember how cows move came to be, right? This is kind of a cliche a little bit by now, but it
I do
was.
remember, but you're so known for these one-liners, and but not everybody maybe heard the original episode. So why don't you give that story real quick?
Yeah. So Chaos Move comes from I was at an advisory engagement with a client, and the question that we were talking about was, we failed this identity project, and we had engaged this vendor, and the vendors told us to do it this way, and then it didn't lead to the proper outcome. And so to that, I said, well, your problem is that cows moo. And so a vendor is going to lead you down a path where, obviously they will maximize the value they can provide, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to solve the problem the way you want it solved, because you're asking a cow to do something other than moo, and cows moo. That's all they do.
I call these one-liners. I don't even call them catchphrases because I think a catchphrase is something that you say all the time, right? You might say these things one time and just like floor everybody in the room, right? And so the last time we had you on, you dropped a one-liner that I mean I probably repeated more times than you, which is that passwords are the herpes of IAM. So this awful condition that most people once they get it they can't get rid of it. Um, have we gotten any better or are we gotten worse when it comes to passwords? I mean, we keep seeing all these ransomware attacks. I mean, that's something that's really I mean, ransomware attacks have been around since we got into IT, right? I mean, that's
Right.
been an attack vector, but like it's front page news nowadays.
It's
So is
intensifying.
the password problem getting better or worse?
I would say worse. I think that, to elevate the whole purpose of the IM to another level. I remember at some point I used to coin this term passworditis, which is a term I used to describe this disease that you can contract by having too much dependency and too much reliance on passwords. And then common symptoms include your accounts being stolen, your password getting brute force attacked, or account stuffing, or a whole lot of password reset calls. So if you suffer from any of that, most likely you have passworditis. That's kind of the way to think about it. I would say that I guess it's appropriate to say, talk about pandemic and epidemic, but I would say we have a passworditis epidemic that is not getting any better. And we have the technology, we had it for a while, and I think that what we haven't overcome is this mindset change that needs to happen. Um, even end users would prefer a passwordless option if we were to give them one. But I think we're too attached to this password being the initial point, the default mechanism to authenticate end users. So until we change that mindset, I don't think we'll really conquer this disease.
Passworditis sounds like something that could impact your longevity, right? Or at least impact your quality of life, which I think is what the longevity angle is all about. So maybe we can talk about that angle a little bit more later, but certainly it is your point is well taken about it being more or less a disease.
Yeah, and the thing is, I'm very outspoken. I have been on the topic of passwordless for no less than 4 years. I remember Identiverse in Chicago. I think it was 2018. My topic was moving to a passwordless world, and the idea was, this is not necessarily rocket science. This is how you could get from point A to point B, and most of this is attainable. What I think I'm left with is this sense that people aren't comfortable, but we spend a lot of time researching end users and UX research, and the conclusion, pretty much in all cases, is that end users are okay to let go of the password if you give them another choice. That choice needs to be less frictional, for sure, um, and ideally more secure. So you're looking for more security and more convenience. There are many choices. You could argue in the sense of how secure they are, but I would probably say that no matter what you choose, it's going to be more secure than the password. So from a baseline perspective, you're already assured to move up. Now, convenience, etc. You would have to then research some more and offer not just one but multiple choices, that the user can pick from. But the net is it's you who have to make the effort. You, the deployer, you, the product developer, you, the technology provider, the CISO, the organization that is providing the experience to the end user. We can't expect end users to do this on their own. In fact, if you give, I forgot it was, I think at some point it was Google or Facebook that for a long time been tracking, they give away two-factor authentication as an option in the app. You can sign up and voluntarily sign up. It's not required. And it's something in between 5 and 10% of the users that actually opt in, despite everything that we've seen. So it is too frictional for the end user.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading an article very recently it was written by the CISO at Microsoft, and he made a good point, right? The only people who like passwords are the hackers, right? They love passwords. Users hate passwords. Corporate security hates passwords. Um, does anybody other than the hackers like passwords?
No, but we somehow still refuse to just take it upon ourselves to remove them. I feel I don't know if I would say it's inertia or laziness or attachment. I'm not going to get very philosophical here, but there is something that is absolutely not technology. There's something that's absolutely not cost that is preventing us from making that leap. If you do the math, and we've done that, in the past, the cost of a password compared to any alternative is something like 10 to 1 in terms of cost. A password call, depending on your organization, could be anywhere between $15 to $35 password reset call. So imagine that. Imagine how much you could save. How much room is there to move to something that is a win for the end user, win for security. You were talking earlier, Jim, about the ransomware that is, I think, you know, very, very common, very frequent now. It's really humbling to see, what's going on, what's happening. In organizations are now even many are setting aside money in the form of bitcoins just simply to pay off for ransomware. So it's a forfeit conclusion that you will be attacked, that you will be successful, and you would have to pay the ransom. So I feel like, wow. And then you look at the majority of the attacks. Majority of the attacks end up being a compromised credential, and majority of those are passwords. So if we applied a fraction of that energy to eliminating the password, I think we would just gain so much in avoiding all of this nonsense.
Okay, I have to follow up on that one and do a little side track on this ransomware. So, and I've seen or read about or whatever what you're talking about in terms of companies getting ahead of the game, right? Getting a Bitcoin wallet, setting aside money because they're expecting to get ransomed at some point. Um, I read an article the other day where it was saying something like, you know, um, governments are a, a key focus for ransomware, and I was thinking to myself, no, they're not, and the reason is they don't pay the ransom.
That's right.
And to me, it seems like companies paying the ransom, right? And it's real easy to sit in my ivory tower and say, don't pay the ransom, right? But that is what keeps them, that's what keeps the bad guys going,
Of
right?
course.
If these attacks weren't successful, if they weren't getting millions of dollars,
Yeah.
they wouldn't do them.
Well, and then think about this: the Colonial Pipeline, just to pick one out of the pool. Recently, I have switched to an electric car many years back, so I didn't feel it. But many of my friends were telling me that they could see the price of gas increasing as this was unfolding, and so it's not like you have much time to figure out what to do after the attack. So paying the ransom sometimes is just the only logical option. It's easy for us to judge that from the outside. Um, but I would just invite everyone to consider the possibility of investing a fraction of that into removing passwords altogether. You know, Even organizations. I read the article you were referencing, Jim, about the Microsoft CISO, and I thought it was commendable. The way that article was statements made. Having said that, I still go back to something that resonates or sticks in my. Maybe I'm just too biased to detect this, but you see, we talk about multi-factor authentication. We talk about two-factor authentication, and that's technology that has proven to be effective and all of that. It does add friction, and therefore the low adoption that you see on Google, Facebook, and so forth. But when we design multi-factor authentication from the onset, everyone defaults to first factor is a password, second factor is something else, a text message, a one-time code of some kind, or maybe a biometric. But the first one is a password. Why? Let's just for a moment challenge that. It, I think in our last episode, I was talking about how do we get away from passwords. One of my suggestions was if you're going to do two-factor authentication, just reverse the order. Start with the non-password factor first, then consider maybe adding a risk evaluation, and then of course then the next factor, which if you like it so much, fine, let it be a password. Ultimately, you would see that you don't want it, you don't need it. No one's going to call you back that they want their passwords. But the point being is, again, it's sort of like a paradigm. Like we just all of us. I mean, I'll just throw myself. Are defaulting to no matter what, there is a password involved. The best we can do is just add another factor to it. No, that's not true. We could do better.
So we've talked an awful lot about kind of this disease, right? The condition of passwords. And passwordless is, a potential treatment for this.
Yes.
And I guess I wonder, is it the solution or is it a solution when it comes to managing passwords? Because what you just referenced right around MFA, and maybe this is an area that could certainly see some improvement, is reprioritizing where does the MFA authentication actually take place, right? I think most people are used to typing in ID, a password, and then getting a code and typing that in, or, acknowledging a push notification or whatever it may be.
Right.
but maybe it's time to refactor the way that works and start with the MFA and then challenge from there.
That's right.
So that could be an option. Doesn't get rid of the password, but maybe lessens the usage of it.
Correct.
And then there's some benefits of that, right? You can, potentially use stronger passwords, passwords that don't change as often,
Right.
or only
Passphrases.
as needed. Yeah, exactly. So I'm wondering, from a passwordless solution, I guess right now, given where we're at, I kind of see it as a solution and not the solution, as much as I would love to see it become the solution. I just don't know if we're there yet.
Well, I don't think, the continuum, right? Meaning we want people to access sensitive information online securely and conveniently, being the kind of the statement, the ultimate goal. And then in the process of authenticating, establishing who you are, we have a password. So eliminating the password moves us closer to that ideal, end state. So it's a step. It's not the destination. If you remember last August when we talked, I was saying that once you eliminate passwords from the flow, then you land at new problems that you have to go tackle. But I would much rather we focus on those problems than where we are today, because still would be a win for everybody. And my thinking is that we're just holding this up in a mindset, in a paradigm that needs to go away. And if we were just to say, well, look, assume there's no pass. For example, you run a development team, product development team, and you're launching a new app. At some point in your development, you're going to say, well, sure, we need to authenticate the user. 99% of the time, people would automatically put username, password right in that. Okay, then you have to think about, well, I'm going to write test cases. Right, so test cases have to be written to figure out the password, the error messaging, this and that and the other. And of course, I have to put in a password recovery flow. So that's a whole bunch of hours of development and testing and so on and so forth. Then you get your pen testing team involved, because they have to make sure that this is secure. Then you got to get audited, and depending on the sensitivity of the app, then you get external auditors that will tell you your password policy is not compliant, and you have to force every 90 days people changing passwords and these complex rules and all that. I mean, hours and wasted money that shouldn't have been wasted in the first place. If we had just started with the point is no passwords. We're going to have to figure another way to authenticate the user. And from there on, everything gets simpler, you move into another dimension. You would have to think about, well, can I assume that the user has a phone number, a mobile device? Can I assume that there is a smart app or a mobile app that I can couple and use to do that second factor? Are there other mechanisms that I could use? And then, permute through, well, okay, if I assume this, then this should be true. If I can't assume that for 100% of the cases, what's the next best alternative, and on and on. We did some interesting study. I think, Jim, you'd appreciate this one, where I partner with my UX team. And part of what we were testing was, assume we have all these options. We wanted to test which ones would be more intuitive to the end user. So we designed this login experience where different options, passwordless options, would come up at the top. The ones we prefer would come up, and we just wanted to see how intuitive this was to the end user. Of course, one of those options ultimately was the password. But I remember I presented this at a client conference, and I told them how much I love working with the UX team, because we use iconography to communicate the intent. So you have one-time code, and then you have this little cell phone icon with a code in there. You have push notification with a fingerprint, so you have a little fingerprint thing in there, and voice communicate, like it will call your number and voice over the one-time code. So it's a little speaker thing in there. And then of course it came to passwords, and we were iterating what would be the right icon to the intent, to show the intent. So I forced that to be the poop emoji, because I think that captures the essence of what a password really is or should feel like. And so, of course, when we tested this out, no one clicked on that poop emoji. Success.
All right. So you've sold me on, I want to go passwordless, right? How do I get started? I know that you're working on this at Greenshades.
Yeah.
this journey to go passwordless, at least for some part of your organization or maybe customers.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how did you get started? Because I think this is really key where a lot of, I don't know anybody who's going to argue and say, yeah, I don't want to be passwordless, right? I think people like the idea of it, but they don't know where to start.
Sure.
How did you go about getting this in place for the use cases that you're looking to solve it for?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing is you have to embrace UX, right? You got to start developing empathy for the end user and understand who they are, how they operate, what do they do every day. People don't wake up in the morning thinking, I just want to log in. They log in because they had to do something. What is that something they need to do? And you need to deeply understand what is that interaction. So, for example, in our cases, we know that about 41% of our end users are using a mobile device. So we can assume that a big chunk of the transactions could be, instead of a password, an OTP out to that device. We require emails because we're going to send you, not just for authentication, but we're going to send you notifications around things to approve, when you get paid, et cetera, et cetera. So we have an email. In many cases, it's a corporate email, which happens to be protected by a stronger authentication mechanism. So why don't we just anchor on that? And we can argue here. I know that many people would be saying, well, you're not going to send a one-time code to an email, are you? I would say, well, for a corporate email address, still more secure than a password. We could, go disagree on that, but the data that we have would say that that's still a win even then. So the key here, Jeff, is you don't want to take everything away day one, but you want to start thinking about what options are viable for you. We did a research a few years ago that was very interesting. We were trying to prove that in the corporate world, most people end up, that we could assume that people have a mobile device at work. That was the premise of the research. And the researchers asked very interesting questions. So we established that for the majority of the workers, not only they use a cell phone at work, some of them take it to the bathroom. That came up in the research. And many of them have two, because sometimes they have a corporate issue cell phone. So you have two, not one, two at work. And then we asked this very interesting question where it was, imagine that you left your house, you're going to the office, back in the day when people actually went to offices, and you're halfway through and then you realize you forgot your cell phone, your mobile device. What happens next? So something like 80% would go back home, pick up the phone and come back, even if you're going to go get to the office late. Same question, but this time what you left at home was your wallet. 80% the other way. People would still make it to the office before going back and picking up their wallet. So that affinity with the mobile device is huge. And I think we should use that to empower the end user. We manage at Greenshades, we manage a very diverse worker population, but I would describe them as predominantly deskless workers. So they don't have a desk. They don't have a computer at their desk. They are exclusively mobile. Now, the majority of them are actually hourly workers. So when they log in, they're looking to punch in. So for Christ's sake, make that simple, because every second you add, so they will remember their password and then forget it and then recover it. That's time they're not clocking. So that's money they're not earning, if you think about it that way. And so you have to understand like the psychology of that end user. You got to get really intimate with what's driving them. What are they trying to do? And then, of course, come up with the right options. My sense is that you don't take the password on the first go. You give an option, let those options play out, learn, figure out how they're working, correlate that with what you would expect to see. What would you expect to see? Well, reduction in fraud. Okay. Are we seeing that? Great. Reduction in phone calls for password resets. If you see them, that means you're moving in the right direction. Keep iterating, and then you would end up in a place where most likely you don't need the password. In the type of offering that we provide, we have an interesting mix of what you would call consumer and enterprise, meaning these are employees of our client, so technically enterprise, but they're end users. So to us, they're almost consumers, right? But what is interesting is you could, in many cases, assume or use the fact that they are authenticating into their enterprise. So we could federate them into our app. So now, again, a paradigm change, right? If you federate in to our app, to us, you eliminated a password. We don't have to worry about that. So we effectively eliminated a password. And, whatever the enterprise uses to authenticate on their side, well, that remains. We're just leveraging that. And I think that's another way to think about how you eliminate passwords. That's another option to do it.
Frank, I want to talk about the user experience or the customer experience, but even before that, I want to point out something to the folks that are listening that you're not just here as a strategic advisor from Hyper, right? Pushing product, right? You were at your prior employer when you were at ADP. I was a longtime ADP user.
That's right.
And the authentication experience went from horrible, to not that bad, right? When it was password based, it was horrible. And, as a recent user, it really wasn't that bad. So you've actually implemented the things you're talking about, right? Making passwordless an option. You've done this in the real world, so you're speaking from experience. But let me keep going here, because there's one other point that I want to make, which is that ADP is, as far as complex, large scale identity and access management, quote unquote, problems to solve, it's as big as it gets.
It's huge.
Hundreds of thousands of customers,
Yep.
hundreds of millions of users.
That's right.
And look, I work with organizations all the time who, when they face those corner cases, they say, well, something like passwordless won't work because, we've got these corner cases.
Right.
It'll work for 98% of our user population, but these other 2%, so we have to design the dummy solution that will work for 100%. And I think that's the trap that a lot of folks fall into, right?
Yes.
Is solving for the corner cases rather than solving for the 98% and then having a fallback solution. Okay, those 2%, they can use a password,
100%.
but because still at 90, if you solve 98% of the problem, you've reduced your attack surface quite significantly.
But again, think about the end user for a sec here. It's just the thing that I invite everyone to explore is consider the other side of the table. So for a moment, you are protecting, let's just say for now, the paycheck of that worker. And for whatever reason, that account gets hacked, and now their paycheck gets rerouted. They direct deposit and they get rerouted to the wrong account. Now that person is not getting paid. All right. And it's severe inconvenience for that person not to get paid because they probably have mortgage payments and things anchor on that paycheck hitting. So they have to go tackle that. Well, they're busy working. Now they have to go tackle this. The employer has to do whatever repairs they need to, and the provider get involved in all that, such that we can remedy the situation and potentially go chase the bad guys, and in many cases, return the money back. But boy, is that intense. Isn't that damaging? Isn't that stressful for that person? If you think about people who live paycheck to paycheck, and again, deskless workers, hourly workers, they tend to be in that segment of the population that a paycheck is significant. Missing a paycheck is catastrophic. So we all need to think about our responsibility in preserving the wellness of that person, even the mental health of that person. Like imagine the stress someone is. And I hope that everyone that tackles problems like this feels that sense of, accountability, the sense of you're impacting that person's life. That person cannot clock in, they're not getting paid. And that is on you, and so to understand it to that level, I think would help you then be more open to exploring. Like you said, you can't solve it for 100%. You have to think about this as a multi-layer problem. Solve it for the majority. Give options to the rest. Yeah, you do have exceptions, but don't penalize everyone just because you're solving for 100% and not 95%. Jim, we did the research on this. So let me tell you the story. This is interesting. We had a password self-service flow that gave you three options. You can send a one-time code to the cell phone, to the email, and or security questions, challenge. Like if you still believe that stuff, exists in the wild, there's still places where that happens. Now, the success rate of the OTP via text message was something like 70+%. Email was a little less because sometimes we would have the wrong email address or it would go into the spam folder. The challenge questions were like 20% or something. So it was a horrible thing. And they were choosing only like 5% of the time. So people would prefer one-time code when they were self-servicing their password. So then we started doing this other analysis and we found that some population, like people who reset their passwords, were what we call sporadic users. So they wouldn't come every day. They would come maybe once a year, every 6 months. Every time they come, we had them go through this process. They will forget their password. It was locked anyway. So they had to then go through the self-service, the recovery anyway. So here was the story. So this user comes in every so often. Every time they come, they automatically, almost inevitably, end up in the forgot password flow. 95% of the time, they would pick an OTP to their cell phone, and they'll succeed over 70% of the time. All right? And then they come right back out of there into the login page so that we would then ask them to create a new password. And then this whole process would repeat again, 3 to 6 months from now. That's silly, So we did something interesting, which was at the moment you reset the password, we just simply say, do you want to create a new password? You just want to log in right now. And then it was a disproportionate amount of people that wanted to log in right now. That proves the point. Like people are not going to be missing their passwords. No one is going to call you. I challenge, end users calling the help desk saying, look, I love my password. I want it back. Give it to me.
They're real gluttons for punishment if they're doing that. Yeah, I think of the strategy that some people have where, instead of maybe using a password manager, right, or something where they're having to keep track of their hundreds, if not thousands of accounts, right, is they just generate something random, log in the once, and they don't remember it.
Right.
And then the next time they need to log in, they just click forgot password and go into it.
Yeah.
Probably something that isn't good for maybe a day-to-day account, but maybe if it's something that you only access a couple times a year, yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah. I mean, password vaulting is, we're talking about diseases and herpes. So yeah, it's a little thing, a pill you can take here and there, and it would just, it would ease off the pain, and you would pretend that you don't have that disease, but it is not a solution. It's just, a Band-Aid. But yeah, I mean, if number one, you have one that hasn't been hacked. A few years ago, if you remember, there was one of them that got hacked. And so imagine all of that problem. But, then you have to make sure that it works in all your devices, which I would say is a very, very difficult claim to make, and they don't necessarily all work very nicely on native mobile apps. Again, most of our users end up being in the mobile space. So, I mean, it's okay. It's better. I would say if you're going to do that, may as well just invest in passphrases. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to advocate passphrases. I think we should eliminate the whole thing. But if you're going to stay with passwords, at least end up there, passphrases. That's statistically much better.
So we've been talking an awful lot about, going passwordless and getting this instituted. And I think that we see a lot of vendors in this place, right? Hyper is certainly one of them, but we also know things like One Cosmos, and there's a Secret Double Octopus, and a whole bunch of other crazy named ones. But then there's also the big players, right? Microsoft, Okta, Ping. They all claim to have a passwordless approach. I don't know if it's necessarily truly passwordless, because I think it's more of a push notification prompt, really, that is probably doing the authentication. But this begs me the question of why do I need to pay extra for a quote unquote passwordless technology if I'm already using Okta or Ping? Is it good enough, right? Or is there enough of that value add on an extra product that really then takes it that extra way to get it, further along the passwordless journey.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, you have to think about this kind of on a time continuum. The reality is many of those vendors that are established came from a world where the primary goal was to do single sign-on, and then multi-factor authentication or even passwordless authentication came as an afterthought, came after. It was added on. But if you were to start today, you have FIDO 2.0. And I would say that's the best technology can offer today in the realm of, passwordless. So from an end user perspective, passwordless is passwordless. But when you think about the security and convenience, if you were to just plot it in a chart, then FIDO 2.0 is further up to the right. And my prediction is that's where it goes. That at the limit, that's where we go. Today, if you do two-factor with a push, you're like already in the bleeding edge. Yesterday, it was the bleeding edge just to send a text message to your cell phone. And before that, it was a magic link into your email, right? So we're progressing, but I think at the limit, FIDO 2.0 satisfies the most that we had to deal with. I think that's a more sustainable, long-term, scalable solution. It's native to the device. So do you care about that? Well, if you're thinking long term, you probably would. You want to invest on that technology today. You want to implement it sooner so you can get the most value right away before it becomes mainstream. And then you would be scrambling to adopt it, down the road. The other is if you care, there are specific nuances when it comes to the sensitivity of the transactions. And so, we don't need to get into the technical details, but FIDO 2.0 and those technologies prove out to be more secure for financially sensitive transactions than other alternatives. And so if you're doing this, now you think about, I care a lot about security and I want to do it in a way that is convenient to the end user, filter for those two, you end up right there. And so I think at the moment, it would be more of those that care about that specific distinction. But I think at the limit, this will become mainstream. This would be like, that's how you do it. There are some interesting developments, I think, that make this interesting. We were doing research, many applications, you develop a web front end and then a mobile app companion. But the adoption of mobile app, there's application fatigue, so not everybody downloads the mobile app. With FIDO, you have an option called appless. So it's native in the device. You can still, use two-factor on the device with biometric without having to develop a new app. I think that's a huge win from a usability and security perspective. So we'll see. I'm very passionate about this. I think that companies like Hyper are setting a high standard for where this problem should be addressed and how it should be addressed. That ultimately, I believe, will become mainstream.
So as we start to wrap up the conversation here around passwordless, I'm curious, from your perspective, what's the most sensible approach to actually getting rid of passwords? From what I've gathered from this whole conversation, right? It's not an overnight success. It is a journey, and there are various iterations that you're going to go through and options that you'll provide out to, whoever your customer is of your current password experience. What is something that people who are listening today can kind of take away and say, okay, how should I start positioning my organization to really drive towards passwordless, right? Let's stop talking about it and let's start doing it.
So I would invite everyone to kind of consider or research the items that don't take it at face value, but consider how many of those end users that you serve carry or interact with you on a mobile device. Just get a real sense of that yourself. And then consider, for example, if for the kind of business, the kind of engagement that you are driving anyway, you do need to engage with them and you collect their cell phone and email. You may be already, required to do that anyway, but you're not using that to facilitate a stronger passwordless login. That's a missed opportunity. So start there. Start, analyzing the kind of the demographic, the sort of the interaction points, and the data requirements. You may already have more than what than what is necessary to get going.
So, Frank, I'm wondering if you had an opportunity to listen to episode 100. We had Victor Barris on the call, and he waxed poetic about the history of identropy. Um, and your name came up a couple of times, but specifically, your name came up around kind of being one of the main proponents of the corporate culture. Frank, you're one of the most passionate people I know. I know you know you've always been passionate about soccer. You've always been passionate about health. I know at one time you were very passionate about corporate culture and what it meant. And in my experience at Identropy, it was is revolutionary. I'm wondering, are you still passionate about that? Are you still driving that and talking about the importance of corporate culture?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of my responsibility here at Greenshades. I think that there is no way a company can succeed unless you pay attention to culture. And you have a choice. You can do nothing, let the culture emerge, or you actively work to create the culture and cultivate the culture that you want. Identropy was to me a fascinating. I listened to that episode and it was emotional because I remember many of those episodes, many of those steps in the journey. They talk about FedEx Day. I remember we borrowed that idea from Atlassian, and the late Tony Shea at Zappos. We borrow a lot of what they did there, and he helped us. You have to do something to cultivate it, right? And make it so that for the employee, for the individual, coming to work becomes a rewarding experience. It can't be that you just come in, do the work, and nothing happens. You have to have this affinity with what you're doing. There has to be a sense of purpose, and you have to feel good about working at a place that you identify with, you coworkers. But that's not an accident. You got to work at it. So I do that here. I have the opportunity to do that here at Greenshades. I think we have an amazing culture. I'm very happy to fit in and have been being given the chance to shape it and help mold it.
So I know you're passionate about passwords and your disdain. Let's just put it lightly. Your disdain for passwords, right? What is something that is non-identity related that you're passionate about? I know we've talked a little bit about kind of living a long life and wanting to play soccer. I think more and later into life. What is that? Is that a passion of yours?
Yeah, I would say I somewhat, during the pandemic, I discovered this. So I think it goes something like this. I couldn't play as much soccer as I could because we were uncertain about, getting together and all that. So I started cycling. Because I started cycling, I started to listen to more audiobooks. And then somehow I started to listen to audiobooks on longevity. And then I thought, wouldn't it be nice to put some of these things to work, experiment on myself so that I could potentially expand my lifespan so I can play more soccer. So I'm happy to report that the experiment is going well. I'm averaging about 7 games per week, which is something I didn't do when I was a teenager. I'm still cycling, and so far it seems like a lot of the signs of longevity, it's working. It isn't necessarily ask me when I get to 120, so let's just wait it out for a moment here. but at least from what I can see and how I feel, I think there's a lot of benefit in putting some of this to work. It isn't as hard as I initially thought.
I can imagine Frank at 90 years old out there like schooling all the young kids, with I don't even know what it would be, whether it's like nutmegging them on the field or whatever it may be, right? Ball between the legs.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I have my career path like already laid out. So I will play until I can't, if they amputate my legs, maybe I'll play goalie. And then after that, I will then most likely either coach or become a ref. And then, of course, as a ref, your lifespan diminishes because you're going to make the wrong call, and then someone's going to hurt you, and that's the end. So that's that's the end.
At the risk of alienating some of our global audience, do you have a soccer or football team that you cheer for?
Boy, oh boy, this is a tough question. I do, and I know this. So all my friends, everyone that listens to this, I love you. if this doesn't change anything, Real Madrid is my team. It's been my team since I'm 6. I know I'm going to be unpopular after saying this, but I can't help it. A la Madrid.
Don't hold it against Frank. Jim, what's your non-IAM passion?
Well, I do have to comment on something that Frank said, and that it's, I hope passwords are dead by the time he's 90 or 120 or whatever. So that's one thing I hope. My passion is actually quite similar. So I love staying active and being fit. I go to the gym pretty much 6 days a week. Um, one thing with the pandemic is that now that everybody's working from home, you see a lot more virtual happy hours. And I still attend virtual happy hours, but I won't be drinking a cocktail at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. on a weekday. Um, Believe me, I like a good cocktail. Right, I'm not sitting here as a teetotaler, but I want to get that gym time in. And originally, when I first started lifting weights, it was because I had a very bad back problem. I was actually going to a surgeon and thinking about getting a fusion of my lower spine. And his recommendation was I wouldn't do it if I were you at the age that I was. And so I started going to the gym and like exercising my core. And it made such a difference. And I strengthened my core. And then I started saying, well, I'm here anyway. Why don't I do some push ups and do some legs? And then it became, I started doing more, right? And I started noticing the weight coming off and, putting on a little bit of muscle. And it's like, heck, I actually like how I look. I'm going to keep at this. And, now it's like, I don't even think about my back. I don't think about going there for how I look. To me, it's like, it's my time. I go to the gym after work. We work hard and, I don't know if we play hard, but we definitely work hard. After the work day, going to the gym and being able to sweat and focus on lifting that weight, it really just puts me in a totally different zone. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about my problems at work. I'm also not one of the people to sit there on my cell phone in between sets, right? I'm there. I am listening to my music, and I'm working hard. And so that's kind of, I'd say that's one of my passions.
So Jim, I'm gonna give you something interesting. I might give you a hack. You may thank me afterwards. So part of what I have been learning in terms of longevity is, there's a study on the fact that many European populations end up very living healthy and active until their hundreds. And a common theme is that they drink wine, red wine specifically. So studies are showing that there is an enzyme in that wine, in certain kinds of red wine like Chianti and Pinot Noir, called resveratrol. And resveratrol is a high potency antioxidant. So the hack is at 5 or 6 p.m., you could actually drink 1 or 2 glasses of wine right before you go to sleep. And then after you go to sleep, you literally just sleep like a baby. And that's healthy for you. So now I find myself telling my wife, and my wife said, "What is that? You're drinking again?" I said, "Well, it's for my health. It's a health thing."
That is a good life hack. What about you, Jeff?
It's probably no surprise, right? I think just general curiosity when it comes to technology. I'm always tinkering with things in the tech world. It's just the way I've always been. I am my father's son. Always been a tinkerer. I remember way back when, there was a video game I wanted to play for those old school enough, Wing Commander, the original one. And, I thought, oh, that looks really cool. I want to play it. But for me to play it, I had to build a computer. I had never done it before. So got the parts, learned how, DOS worked, set it all up, became intimately familiar with Visa drivers, if you're old enough to remember those, and all the troubleshooting that went into getting those fixed. So, and that's carried on throughout my life, right? I mean, we started this podcast, didn't know a darn thing about podcasting, but we've figured it out as we've gone along. And, I kind of like that. I think it helps keep my mind sharp. And, it certainly served, I think, well from a professional standpoint, being able to understand how the technology works, what are the usability issues around it sometimes. But then just from day to day, right? How can you take advantage of the tools you've already got and make it stronger? So, in a short word, tech doodads, things like that. That's definitely my passion. So I think that's probably a good spot that maybe we can leave it for this week. But before we go, any final words of wisdom, Frank?
Well, no, I would just say let's make sure you consider the end user, develop empathy for the end user, and consider how you could help eliminate passwords today.
Jim, what about yourself?
I've got a book recommendation for everybody. I've been reading Hacking Multi-Factor Authentication by Roger A. Grimes. He's going to be on the show, episode 109. That'll go live on Labor Day in the U.S., so September 6th. So if you get a chance prior to the episode, buy a copy of the book. I think it's on Amazon for around $30 or less. It's really interesting stuff. I've referenced it a few times now, but just a plug. It's not my book, but I think it's a great one.
There's always good reading material out there, and that's definitely one conversation I'll be looking forward to. And we'll have a bunch of links in our show notes today for some of the things we've talked about, so you can connect with Frank on LinkedIn. You can learn more about what kind of Greenshades does from their perspective, but also Hyper, hypr.com, certainly a player in the passwordless space. We'll put a link in there to that article that was referenced around the Microsoft CISO and how they're looking to get rid of passwords. And we'll put a link also to the book that Jim just mentioned. So lots of stuff for people to check out there. As always, thank everybody for listening. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe and give it a 5-star rating or a thumbs up or whatever the best thing is. And if you didn't like it, send it to an enemy. That's cool too. As long as people are listening, we don't care. And with that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Frank, thank you so much for joining us. Jim's, thank you as always. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.